So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the fourth in this year's series of glorious Gifford Lectures. Some of you are here in the room with us while others are watching remotely, either via the live stream on YouTube or listening to a recording at some unknown time in the future. It's wonderful to be able to have such a diverse range of audiences. Not only the people here in the room, University of Edinburgh students, staff, and the wider community, but also from further afield, other parts of the United Kingdom, Europe, and all over the world. So wherever you are, and whatever time zone or indeed year you are in, you are very welcome. I'm Helen Bond, Chair of Christian Origins here at the University of Edinburgh. I was formerly head of the School of Divinity, and in that capacity was a member of the Gifford Nominating Committee. At this stage in the series, I don't really think that Professor Alexandra Walsham needs any further introduction. Those of you who've attended the lectures already will know that she's not only an eminent Cambridge historian, but also a gifted wordsmith. And the beauty and accessibility of her prose is something we can all aspire to. These lectures really are a feast for the ears just as much as the little grey cells. So I'm particularly looking forward to today's lecture. Tantalizingly titled Conversions, it delves into one of the most profound aspects of the Reformation era: the intense and often tumultuous transformations of religious identity. Professor Walsham will explore the powerful impulses and ideas that inspired many to move from lukewarm or nominal faith to fervent zeal. In a time of profound religious upheaval, individuals face the difficult choice of whether they could find salvation within their existing religious institutions, or whether they needed to break away entirely. The lecture also promises to examine the social and moral challenges faced by apostates and those who switched denominations or even converted to entirely new faiths. These shifts in belief often coincided with literal movements, as individuals with fluid religious identities also led highly mobile lives. The lecture also explores the missionary impulses that shaped the early modern world. We are in for another insightful and thought-provoking exploration. So please join me in welcoming Professor Walsham. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen, for your warm welcome and introduction. So, today's lecture focuses on the theme of conversions. Conversion is another polyvalent word connoting movement. In particular, it refers to the act of turning. The turning in question takes place in space and time, in the individual heart, and in the external world. It involves a change in position, direction, character, nature, and physical form. In a religious context, it signals a transformation or translation from one faith or denomination to another, or from a state of indifference or minimal commitment to one of greater intensity and zeal. The roots of its use to signal a reorientation of the human soul towards God lie, of course, in Scripture. The Hebrew word shub means turn. Its Greek equivalent, metanoia, is usually translated as repent. To convert is thus not merely to turn, but to return from error and sin. It describes a kinetic process that is both active and passive, and that is sometimes complete, but often feels imperfect or partial. It encapsulates a movement that can be repeated and reversed but it can also be a milestone on a linear journey towards eternal salvation. The Reformation was a significant juncture in the history of conversion. In the Middle Ages, to convert was to exchange secular life for monastic obedience, to enter an order and to take a set of binding vows. After the fragmentation of Christendom, this sense retreated. What emerged in its place was first an emphasis on the universal obligation to abandon falsehood for truth, and second, a common aspiration of clergy and laity alike to strive for deeper personal faith. The trajectory of the word conversion follows that of religion itself. It signals a shift from seeing religion as the preserve of the self-consciously devout, confined to the cloister, to seeing it as a state of spiritual being that all should seek to achieve. Conversion between faiths and within faiths converged on this same objective. Jean Delumeau famously called it Christianization. I turn first to the experience of conversion before addressing the phenomena of changing sides and switching faiths. I then examine the missionary effort to evangelize the indigenous peoples Europeans encountered in other parts of the globe with the aim of rescuing them from infidelity and heathenism. Building on the foundations already established, I treat conversion as a special type of soul movement. Inspecting it through the double lens of motion and emotion, and approaching it as both an institutional and a somatic development, I show how the contemporary preoccupation with conversion simultaneously engendered tensions and concerns about sincerity and authenticity. Inner mutability was closely linked with physical mobility, and both were understood as an index of religious flux and social instability. The biblical archetype of religious turning is the conversion of St. Paul. The moment of enlightenment that brings about the transfiguration of the former Pharisee and persecutor Saul occurs in the course of a journey. It happens on the road to Damascus. It brings him to a crisis of self-definition that results in astonishment, trembling, and repentance. It culminates in his baptism and in him becoming a peripatetic evangelist for the new faith, whose visits and empathetic letters to the Corinthians, Thessalonians, Galatians, and Hebrews helped to bring these embryonic churches into being. No less influential in the Christian tradition is the conversion of the Manichae Augustine. As recounted in his Confessions, this was more prolonged, but it too involved a moment of epiphany, precipitated by reading Paul's own epistle to the Romans, which dispels doubt and radically redirects the rest of his life. A third key conversion is the tower experience of Martin Luther in a secluded room in Wittenberg. His spiritual and theological breakthrough followed close study of the same book of Scripture, especially chapter 1, verse 17, "The righteous shall live by faith." Liberated from his fierce and troubled conscience and from the spiritual burden of the doctrine of good works, at this, he said, "I felt myself straightway born afresh and have entered through the open gates into paradise itself." The Cambridge scholar Thomas Bilney was converted by chancing upon a passage in Erasmus's translation of the New Testament. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. This one sentence, through God's instruction and inward working, did so exhilarate my heart, being before wounded with the guilt of my sins, and being almost in despair, that immediately I felt a marvelous comfort and quietness. In each of these classic conversion narratives, conversion is an intensely emotional experience. The inward turn manifests itself in external, affective, corporeal, and behavioral forms. The concept of conversion was both reinvigorated and tested by the advent of the Reformation. It was reinvigorated because what was at stake in this religious movement was salvation. And it was tested because the mechanisms by which people were saved lay at the very centre of the heated intellectual debates that it generated. Catholic soteriology emphasised the active part played by the human will in this process and the critical role of the sacraments and priests. It understood baptism as a critical rite of regeneration. Entangled with the notion that spiritual merit could be earned and accumulated, conversion carried with it a clear element of voluntarism and active choice. It was closely linked with the practice of penitence. The Spanish Dominican Luis de Granada's influential and widely translated Memorial of a Christian Life is a guide to progressing in faith from the moment of the devotee's conversion until the end of his perfection. It is an exhortation to heed the Lord's good inspirations, merciful rebukes, loving speeches, and terrors and threatenings to the soul. It says that marvellous great inward compunction and sorrow will be rewarded with remission of temporal punishment and the promise of glory in the afterlife. The fervent desire of believers for Christ found expression in the motions they felt inside. The supernatural love of God is the beginning of all spiritual affections and feelings. Conversion was a cooperative process in which the Lord and his disciples both had critical roles. Explicitly paralleled with the physical practices of walking, travelling, and running, Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises have been called a gymnastics of the soul. They taught an embodied path towards spiritual consolation, which involved cultivating and scrutinizing powerful emotions: fear, grief, horror, wonder, and joy. The feelings by which one was bestirred, even to the point of shedding tears, were evidence of true conversion and of the mutation of the heart. Effective interiorization was a hallmark of counter-Reformation piety. Protestantism had a different conception of conversion. This revolved around the core Lutheran insight that salvation came by faith alone, which was an external action of grace upon the conscience and the soul of the believer. Human beings had limited agency in this process, though their complete passivity, impotence, and bondage was overstated by the doctrine's Catholic critics. The Protestants' turn towards God was also intimately connected with the idea of repentance, which was understood as involving a change wrought in the heart. This was not a metaphor, but a description of what actually occurred in this organ. Interestingly, Calvin's own personal emblem was a heart held in a hand, inscribed with the motto, prompte et sincere, promptly and sincerely. Protestantism's insistence that it was not a new religion explains its emphasis on conversion as a form of return to an old truth. Baptism was understood as simply the beginning of a cycle of deeply felt repentance that will consume the Christian's whole pilgrimage through life. Calvinist predestinarianism reinforced the idea that conversion was the result of gratuitous divine mercy, not human volition. It had already been foreseen by God, whose provident care for his children was reflected in this gift. Conversion was not a means of achieving salvation, but a token that one was a member of the tiny, invisible minority of the elect. The principle that the double decree of election and reprobation was inherently mysterious invested the gaining of assurance with greater importance. The evangelical conversion for which English Puritans strove was by definition something they could not achieve themselves. But paradoxically, this served as a spur to sanctification and moral renewal. William Perkins encapsulated the different stages of this restless search for certainty in his table appended to The Golden Chain, which traces the internal motions by which believers acquired knowledge of their soteriological status. The heart is the locus of these movements, which take the form of impulses of hope and sorrow, anticipation and anxiety. The diagram itself is a kinetic device by which one could chart the spiritual geography of the soul. It permitted people to discern the steps that God took to prepare them for receiving the blessing of faith, enabling it by little and little to spring and breed in the heart. One means by which he did so was through the physic of internal and external affliction. Conversion was often conceptualized as the cure of a diseased soul. Protestants blurred the distinctions between cognition and sensation and between somatic and spiritual health. They envisaged conversion as a physiological process that took place in the realm of the flesh and which one quite literally felt. As Protestantism matured, it became increasingly preoccupied with the experience of regeneration or second birth. Conversion became more imperative as time progressed, precisely because most people now inherited their religion as a birthright. They'd not been compelled to choose sides and to put their lives on the line. Now the challenge was to combat the complacency associated with safety and prosperity, and to move from mere conformity to feeling faith. The brand of experimental predestinarianism that flourished in 17th century England and Scotland pivoted on the desire of the godly to be effectually called and adopted by God. Treatises on regeneration and second birth stressed that conversion was accompanied by emotional highs and lows. These were a maze to be navigated and a Morse code to be interpreted. William Baxter's much reprinted work on this subject is an extended meditation on the heartbreaking, heartburning, and humbling that accompanied the infusion of converting grace into the soul, followed by sweet tastes and happy affections. Puritans contrasted this with the corrupt process of entering a Catholic monastic order. Individual lay people told of their own private conversion experiences. They told of the roller coaster of emotions believers felt when they became new creatures in Christ, of great motions of God's Spirit upon their consciences, of bodily breathings and witnessings, and of the profound enlargement of their hearts. Robert Bolton spoke of being converted in terrible tempests and thunder, the Lord running upon him as a giant, taking him by the neck and shaking him to pieces. The Scottish Presbyterian Archibald Johnston, Lord Warriston, remembered being transported out of his body by love, by hope, by joy, and then heavily cast down and melted before God. The gracious dealings of the Almighty with Elizabeth White involved a similar series of soul upheavals, during which she moved from despondency to confidence and sorrow to delight. Following her untimely death in childbirth in 1669, this text was widely disseminated, with editions appearing in London, Glasgow, and Boston. It is a classic account of how one godly woman became sensible of her salvation. Such experiences were testimonies that qualified one for membership of gathered congregations of the elect. Circulated publicly in print and collected into anthologies, they also helped to create emotional communities. Devout Protestants across Europe closely scrutinized the operations of the Holy Spirit. Pneumatology was the science of its motions. In 1661, the German Lutheran Theophil Grossgebauer graphically described regeneration as an event that caused greater pain than when a child comes into the world born by his mother. In short, it was a form of travail. These preoccupations came to fuller fruition in Pietism half a century later. The inner trials of Pietists were likewise endowed with a distinctive epistemological quality. Pietist literature taught believers to expect to be tossed and turned by powerful passions. The prolonged struggle of one of its leaders, August Hermann Francke, epitomized the tumultuous process of conversion that became its signature experience. In his much circulated autobiographical Vita, he compared this with a stormy sea which eventually calmed. All sadness and unrest of heart was taken away at once, and I was immediately overwhelmed as with a stream of joy. I arose a completely different person from the one who had knelt down. Across Northern Europe, pious people told how they had moved from lukewarm religiosity to ardent zeal in highly effective terms. The history of emotions encourages us to refuse the assumed dichotomy between emotional scripts and real feelings, which perpetuates the idea that rhetorical representations of identity are inherently inauthentic. Instead, it urges us to recognize the formative power of these narratives in shaping contemporary experiences. Conversion thus subverts our lingering tendency to contrast the emotional reserve of Protestantism with the emotional exuberance of Catholicism. It resists thrusting the Reformation into a mold that highlights the triumph of reason and intellect over affect. It demonstrates that the connections between motion and emotion transcended sectarian divisions. The growing preoccupation with conversion reflects the perception that the very act of believing was a near impossible task. As Ethan Shagan has shown, in the early modern world, many devout men and women were troubled by the thought that they were no better than heathens. They worried that the affective stirrings they experienced might be signs of insincerity, hypocrisy, and even apostasy. They were disturbed by the possibility that the movements they discerned in their hearts and souls might be the fabrications of Satan. They read both an excess and an absence of feeling as evidence that their conversions could be false. They were tormented by the thought that they might be atheists and unbelievers, people whose godless lives betrayed the fact that they'd never really known God at all. As one contemporary put it, this was a hard work, no less than to make stone flesh and darkness light. Aptly described by Louis Rambaud as a vortex of vulnerability, the phenomenon of religious turning must be seen as a facet of what Alec Ryrie calls the emotional history of doubt. As the Reformation progressed into its second and third generations, experiencing true conversion became both increasingly urgent and ever more contested. It became the principal objective of those pursuing the elusive goal of real belief. The permanent schisms within Christendom precipitated by the Reformation stimulated competing initiatives to reclaim people from heresy and popery. In the context of competing churches and confessionalizing states that claimed the right to dictate the religion of their subjects, conversion became synonymous with political consolidation, indoctrination, and identity formation. At a personal level, it confronted individuals with a new dilemma. Should they remain in the church in which they'd been baptized, or should they abandon it as a limb of Satan? It involved weighing up the cost of converting. Were they prepared to face persecution and even martyrdom? Was the spiritual price of living the lie of outward conformity too high? Negotiating these challenges often entailed crossing territorial borders and theological boundaries, not merely between Catholicism and Protestantism, but also between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. A byproduct of religious pluralism, it was both a cause and an effect of the migrations I explored in the last lecture. In the Holy Roman Empire, the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, enshrined in the peace treaties of Augsburg of 1555 and Westphalia of 1648, meant that the confessional orientation of whole states could change overnight. The same occurred in mid-Tudor England, which swung between Catholicism and Protestantism in accordance with the shifting religious priorities of Henry VIII and his children. In their wake, people moved to new locations to practice their original faith. Those who travelled for other reasons, such as trade, diplomacy, military service, tourism, or health, often converted after being exposed to other religious cultures. In a world which regarded truth as singular and indivisible, such decisions carried implications for one's fate in the next life. The frequency with which people shifted their ecclesiastical affiliation is an index of the quest for stability in a time of bewilderment. Such conversions were the subject of apologetic and polemical texts. Their production was a form of self-fashioning that confirmed the legitimacy of their flight after the fact. Written or ghost-written by the converts, their publication was authorized by authorities eager to celebrate their defection from the enemy, to encourage others to follow suit, and to bolster the faith of the wavering. Their aim was to incite and to prevent changes of heart. The reasons they gave for converting were usually intellectual and doctrinal ones, though many expressed their happiness and relief at having escaped from Babylon and found their way into the ark of salvation. If Protestants spoke of having to run from Rome, Catholics talked of being brought back into the fold of the Mother Church. They used the language of emotional liberation, recalling the abundance of tears and flames of ardent love that overcame them. The biblical tropes they invoked were often ones of motion, the return of the prodigal son and the lost sheep. Others described themselves as pilgrims. James Wadsworth's conversion to Protestantism in 1629 retraced the journey of his father, who'd become Catholic after serving as chaplain to the English ambassador to Spain. The spiritual momentum of the convert was closely linked with recollection of physical movement through space. Conversion was compared with the righteous turning of the penitent sinner and the homecoming of the travelling soul. As Michael Questier remarks, regeneration through grace could be aligned with peregrination through churches. Viewed from the other side of the divide, conversion was a form of betrayal and apostasy. Converts were commonly labelled traitors and branded renegades. A derivation from the Spanish for apostate, its creative variant runagate evoked the idea of cowardly movement. So did the contemporary coinage turncoat. Accusations of opportunistic side-changing for worldly advantage were rife. Conversion became a byword for deceit and dissimulation. Those who moved back and forth from falsehood to truth showed that they were swayed by mercenary motives and that their religious convictions were merely skin deep. They exposed themselves to the moral opprobrium reserved for Nicodemites and time servers, whose external behaviour belied what they believed in their hearts. This disjuncture could cause crises of conscience that manifested themselves in affective and corporeal forms. The Italian lawyer Francesco Spira, whose recantation of Protestantism in 1547 led to a downward spiral into despair and death, became the most celebrated emblem of this kind of Christian atheism. Anxieties about hypocrisy particularly crystallized around serial converts who underwent multiple metamorphoses. The mutability of individuals like William Alabaster, Anthony Tyrrell, and Mark Antonio de Dominis, who swapped sides with dizzying frequency, raised fundamental questions about their sincerity. Breeding suspicions that their conversions were pretended, it cemented the emerging preference for defining subjectivity in terms of the presence of deep inner feeling. Intriguingly, in their own writings, these figures drew on vocabularies of motion, drawn from natural philosophy to justify their restless wanderings in search of peace and a solid core of truth. It's perhaps no coincidence that several of them spent their lives wandering around Europe. Similar patterns emerge when we turn to conversions between Christianity and its rival monotheisms, Judaism and Islam. The formal expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula did not solve the problem of purity. It produced a population of Jewish conversos and Moriscos, whose persistence in inherited rituals made them the subject of investigation by the Inquisition. Their dissimulation was directly connected with the sin of superficial and insincere transition to Christianity. Their own casuists sometimes argued that force removed the culpability of a false conversion. As time progressed, concerns about crypto-Judaism morphed into the idea that baptism could not eradicate the Judaism that ran through their veins. It led to the systematic exclusion of those of Jewish descent from holding office or membership of particular institutions. Their crime was their inability to modify their ethnic origin. In a case heard before the Holy Office in Rome, Mariana de Fiori, a convert from Judaism who immigrated to Poland from Danzig via Tripoli, had to answer to charges of apostasy raised by her own Christian husband. Her conversions and reconversions were a function of her mobility, of the need to survive, find security, and integrate into the societies through which she moved. The contradictory testimonies she made during her trial reveal the ambivalences associated with changing religion that faced people who lived between religious worlds in early modern Europe. Elisheva Karlebach speaks of their divided souls. The case of the counterfeit Jew calling himself Joseph ben Israel, who appeared in Newcastle in 1653, is also revealing. Claiming to have come from Hamburg, he said that he'd converted to Anabaptism in Germany before searching for greater purity, improbably in England. He later confessed that his real name was Alexander Ramsay, and he said that he was a Scottish Catholic on a mission to sow discord among Protestants. The author of this pamphlet condemned this chameleon as a hypocritical deceiver. In moving from Judaism to popery, he was simply swapping one form of diabolism for another. The Jews were a floating and diasporic community whose presence was a potent symbol of the simultaneous success and failure of the Counter-Reformation, and whose redemption was the aim of a surge of conversionary preaching in Rome and elsewhere. By contrast, Islam was the religion of the mighty Ottoman Empire, which dominated the Eastern Mediterranean and was encroaching ever closer to the heartlands of Europe. There were some Muslim converts to Christianity, including the North African traveller and diplomat Al-Hassan al-Wazan, who was captured, presented to the Pope, and baptized in Rome in 1520. This slippery and amphibian figure has been immortalized in Natalie Zeman Davis's Trickster Travels in search of Leo Africanus. But it was the thousands of movements in the other direction, from Christianity to Islam, that worried contemporaries more. Many of these reflect the allure of Ottoman culture. Others were the outcome of the enslavement of mariners, sailors, merchants, and passengers of ships captured by the Barbary pirates in Mediterranean waters. They forayed as far afield as Devon and Cornwall, seizing people living in coastal towns and villages. Christian captives often converted, agreeing to be circumcised and follow Muslim rites in the hope of gaining freedom. Concerns about turning Turk found expression in sermons, pamphlets, ballads, and plays. The denunciation of these renegades as untrustworthy dissemblers echoed the charges levelled against other kinds of converts. Those who returned to Britain and sought to be reconciled to the Protestant Church often claimed that they'd only converted because they'd been coerced. Some suspected that this was a ruse to cover the supplicant's own choice and voluntary motion. Joseph Pitts of Exeter, who was captured in 1678 while still a boy, converted to Islam and later escaped and returned home in 1693. and he stressed the cruelties and tortures that had induced him to convert, as well as the bitter remorse that he felt upon doing so. He insisted that he was really a Christian at heart, though admitted that some might call him a hypocrite. The same tale was told by people who renounced the delusions of that great impostor Muhammad in public ceremonies of christening. The joyful and happy conversions of these returned renegades were echoed in the orchestrated emotional performances of penitent Muslim converts in Spain and Portugal. Whether they were originally Moors or former Christians seeking absolution, at their auto da fés, they were expected to pray fervently and lament their sinfulness with a painful heart. The tears shed by onlookers were equally vital in demonstrating their reintegration into the community of the faithful. In Venice, the re-entry of people who'd previously turned Turk was facilitated by the repeated suggestion that fear of violence had caused their apostasy, but that underneath they retained their fidelity to the religion of their birth. This mitigated their offence by locating agency for it outside themselves. It was a palatable narrative that masked the unease about their own malleability that some may have felt. But its effect was surely to reinforce concern about the authenticity of the convert's new identity. As we've seen, alterations between Christian denominations and to and from different faiths often coincided with translations in space. Individuals with mobile identities often led mobile lives. People on the move were perceived to be prone to religious volatility. In the third part of this lecture, I shift attention from converts to converters. The Reformations stimulated a new wave of evangelization. The very word mission, derived from the Latin missus, meaning to send out, emerged in this era. Used interchangeably with journey and pilgrimage, it alludes to the invocation to mobility in Matthew's Gospel 28:19. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, and to the salvific activities of the original missionaries, Christ and the Holy Spirit. Its later use to signify a place, post, station, or base from which roving priests operated obscures its dynamism as a process. Early modern missionaries modelled themselves on the apostles, and especially on the peregrinations of St. Paul. They imitated the holy itinerancy of St. Patrick, St. Boniface, and St. Willibrord, who'd brought Christianity to pagan Europe in the early Middle Ages. Mission both involved relentless movement and was a religious movement itself. This project is typically associated with Roman Catholicism, and particularly with its concerted effort to convert the indigenous peoples of the New World, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, the Far East, and the Pacific. The religious orders embarked on a global project of salvation in the 16th century. Luke Clossy has likened the Society of Jesus to a multinational corporation beset by logistical problems of transportation and communication. The missions undertaken by the Jesuits were mirrored by those made by the Franciscans and Dominicans. They looked back to the roving apostolate of St. Thomas, whom they credited with the plantation of Christianity in India and America prior to the arrival of early modern merchants and traders, conquistadors and settlers. Missionaries such as Francis Xavier and Matteo Ricci travelled vast distances to harvest souls, and their heroic endeavours were celebrated in publications that mapped their itineraries and that circulated almost as widely as the evangelists themselves. Missions were regulated from 1622 by the papal congregation Propaganda Fide, which directed the operations of the French Société de Mission Étrangère de Paris, established between 1658 and 1663 in North America and Asia. Depicted in elaborate frescoes and in the frontispieces of multi-volume histories, missions gave expression to the militant expansionist impulse that animated early modern Catholicism. They were also intimately linked with the rise of empires. Christianization was an ally of Iberian conquest and an instrument of civilization. Missionaries believed that they had a moral obligation to bring the gospel to benighted indigenous people and to free them of enthrallment to false belief, if necessary by force. Akin to crusade, coercive indoctrination was paradoxically a manifestation of Christian caritas and love. Like the persecution of religious minorities in Europe, it was a kind of charitable hatred. The aggressive approach that many missionaries took to converting the native peoples of America and to extirpating superstition and idolatry contrasts with the sweet or gentle way, il modo suave, of accommodation with existing cultures pioneered by the Italian Jesuit Alessandro Valignano in East Asia, where Christianity spread via trade and diplomacy, though that distinction should not be overstated. The psychological assumptions that underpinned mission were rooted in contemporary understandings of the Passion. The management of emotions was central to the objective of effecting the internal movement of the soul. Evangelists sought to harness the unruly impulses, appetites, and motions of non-Christian peoples and to channel them towards true devotion. Catholic missionaries recognized a hierarchy of stages of emotional development in those they evangelized. They understood savages as comparable to wild animals who have hardly any human feelings at all, though the same anthropology imputed them with an inability to control violent instincts, the very object of the wider program to inculcate civility that preoccupied European elites in this period. Some regarded fear as the forerunner of faith in the barbarian mind, as they put it. By contrast, proselytizing the inhabitants of the Far East required a different approach. Matteo Ricci, for instance, carefully cultivated the concept of friendship in his interactions with the Chinese. Jesuit spirituality was rooted in a sophisticated understanding of how to steer the passions through sensual spectacles and emotional performances, such as liturgical theatre and sermons. The rhetorical tradition in which it was rooted privileged the art of movere, the ability to move one's audience. Two further elements of this polycentric Catholic world in motion deserve attention. First, there are the parallel missions launched by the regular orders to reclaim the inhabitants of territories lost to heresy. In England and Scotland, priests trained in continental seminaries returned to reconcile lapsed Catholics and convert Protestants from the 1570s. Condemned as vagrants, runagates, and traitors, they were regularly deported, imprisoned, and executed by the authorities. The itinerant lifestyles and disguises they adopted to evade capture only enhanced their association with deviant mobility. Derived from a Dutch original, the satirical broadsheet on the left, depicting two travelling Capuchin monks, warns that these new, fresh-come friars, sprung up of late, are intent upon seducing much people to their damned estate. But it was the pestilent Jesuits who were most troubling. The arduous journeys that missionaries undertook won them much admiration from the ordinary people to whom they ministered. William Freeman, who worked in the West Midlands in the 1580s and 90s, was recalled for travailing extraordinarily on foot to comfort the meaner sort in weariness of body and sundry perils. Similar reports emanated from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. In late 17th century Bohemia, Albrecht Schanowski, depicted here in the guise of a pilgrim, spent most of his career wandering around the remote corners of this formerly Protestant kingdom. These examples shade into a second category of travelling ministry. New orders like the Lazarists, founded by the former slave galley chaplain St. Vincent de Paul as the Congregation of the Priests of the Mission in 1625, were inspired by the conviction that many inhabitants of the countryside were little better than heathens. The term that the Spaniard Cristoforo Rodriguez coined to describe this was las otras Indias, the other Indies. In France and Italy, Hungary and Poland, rural missions to the poor involving revivalist preaching, catechizing, and moral instruction were a major agent of the reinvigoration of grassroots Catholicism. Jesuits eager to achieve martyrdom regarded their travels in these backward regions as an arm of the Church of Rome's wider mission of Christianization. These initiatives corresponded with the personal struggle to conquer the Indies that Europe's devout discovered within their own hearts. The physical mobility of early modern Catholic missionaries was integral to their sacred masculinity. Their heart-centered spirituality manifested itself in embodied activism. Cults accumulated around the moving bodies of charismatic evangelists. The miracle-working primary and secondary relics of Jesuit saints circulated widely and were the subject of widespread veneration by people keen to tap into their power, including the corpse of Francis Xavier when it arrived in Portuguese Malacca in 1553. Those still alive were likewise revered as sources of supernatural aid. In England, the recusant gentlewoman Jane Wiseman brought her daughters to visit an incarcerated priest, kissing the floor beneath his feet and repenting that she had not gone barefooted thither, as if on a pilgrimage. In the Kingdom of Naples, villagers flocked to the Jesuits in times of disaster and cut off pieces of their habits to preserve as mementos and to use as apotropaic remedies. The many millions of devotional items that circulated around the early modern Catholic world constituted a mobile library of missionary objects. They were vital in the creation of an effective economy of the holy. Sacramentals were key components of this portable Christianity, especially the papally blessed medallions known as Agnus Dei, which also carried indulgences. But so too were reliquary pendants, rosaries, and decade rings. These tactile items were not only sent in huge shiploads to the New World, they were also imported into Protestant countries like Britain to sustain the faith of beleaguered communities there. Possessing them was a source of solace, as well as an incriminating symbol of resistance. Many of those recovered from the ground by metal detectorists must have been lost by their original owners as they traversed the rural landscape. Condemned by the authorities as the Jesuits' trumpery and the Pope's merchandise, these religious commodities were objects in motion. So were books providing spiritual guidance, such as catechisms and primers, the distribution of which was a complementary and surrogate form of missionary activity. The Spanish Dominican Luis de Granada described them as dumb preachers. His Protestant opponents saw them as silent killers. Translation was a central feature of the Counter-Reformation in a double sense. The conversion of texts from Latin to the vernacular and from one language to another occurred in tandem with their physical movement to new locations. What was the outcome of these endeavours? In place of the traditional missionary paradigm of success and failure, scholars now emphasise creative fluidity and cultural mobility. Instead of acculturation, compromise, bricolage, and syncretism, they write of the dialectical interaction, symbiosis, and mutual interplay of missioners and the missionized. They speak of the production of a kaleidoscope of native Christianities. Conversion itself was a contested concept which depended on the perspective of the observer. If evangelists prioritized the internalization of orthodox doctrine, correct external observance and ritual markers of incorporation, such as baptism, others were satisfied with the simple fervour of neophytes. Jesuits regarded an outpouring of emotion as evidence of real inner transformation. In the Upper Palatinate in the 1710s, they repeatedly highlighted this in the reports they sent to their superiors in Rome, celebrating the impact of their impassioned preaching and the penitential processions in which they whipped themselves until the blood flowed. They told how people were drenched in tears, seeing this as the fruit of their evangelical endeavours among lapsed Catholics and Lutherans. This frontier trope recurs in other mission fields, including New France. In Sonora, in Mexico, converts spoke of their hearts being on fire. The status of these affective experiences as markers of authentic conversion effaces the reality of lived experience. The stories people told about how it felt to be converted were themselves shaped by the emotional scripts of the cultures from which they emerged. Protestant missionary initiatives in this period have, by contrast, been neglected until quite recently. This is partly a product of chronology. Initiatives of global outreach comparable to those carried out by the Catholic orders were slower to develop in the Reformed world. Protestants themselves acknowledged the presence of this missionary gap with a mixture of hostility and embarrassment. The very word missionary was synonymous with popery, as this English pamphlet of 1698, exposing their ways of insinuation, their artifices, and several methods by which they served themselves in making converts. It disparaged Catholic evangelists who set out to bewitch people's senses with pomp and show, and to amuse, terrify, and excite them to embrace idolatry and superstition. According to the author, the effect of this was to draw men insensibly from the contemplation of the more spiritual part of religion to its empty outer shell. The superficial emotions this evoked are highly extolled for divine transports and the operations of the Holy Spirit, he said. But the conversions they achieved were superficial, counterfeit, diabolical, and deceitful. They were the result of sinister forms of emotional manipulation. The Protestant project of conversion was spurred by the missionary initiatives of its rivals. They were also a product of the disillusionment of second-generation ministers with popular religion. In England, this finds expression in the steady stream of complaints about the state of piety in the dark corners of the land, the barren counties of the north, West and Wales, where Catholic survivalism abounded and where people were lukewarm, drowsy, and blind in their faith. In 1628, Sir Benjamin Rudyard called upon Parliament to send travelling preachers to these regions, averring that there were some places which were scarce in Christendom, where God was little better known than among the Indians. The spread of Calvinism in some parts of Gaelic-speaking Scotland subverts the stereotype of resistance and recidivism that clung to the Celtic fringe. But the perception that peripheral areas far from the metropole required Christianization persisted, prompting Lutheran initiatives to convert the Sami people of Scandinavia. These inland missions must be linked with the efforts of some zealous Protestants to evangelize the inhabitants of other nations. In the 1650s, Oliver Cromwell formulated ambitious plans for the creation of a council to rival the Catholic Congregation of Propaganda Fide, which would have had 4 divisions dealing with France, Switzerland, and Italy, the Palatinate, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, and the East and West Indies, respectively. The idea that Britain might preach to and proselytize its European Catholic neighbours was a typical piece of patriotic hubris. It occurred at the same time as traffic in the other direction, by refugees fleeing persecution and seeking asylum in these islands, which was another cause for self-congratulation. Although the phenomenon of Protestant mission and godly globalization did not really take off until the later 17th and 18th centuries, a desire to evangelize the American Indians was a motive for some immigrants to New England, including John Eliot, who commissioned a translation of the Bible into Algonquin and helped establish the so-called praying towns in the 1640s, 50s, and 60s. In Bermuda, the double diligence of the Jesuits in poisoning the people of the Far East and other parts of the world was presented as a motive to stir up settlers to have a greater care of the planting of the gospel in the Caribbean. Calvinists in the Dutch East Indies were driven by similar convictions. The foundation of the English Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge in 1698 was followed by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts in 1701. The seal of the SPG was a ship under sail, heading towards a distant shore, on which people stand in a posture of expectation, inscribed with the motto, Transiens adjuva nos, come over and help us. An allusion to the Macedonians' appeal to St. Paul in Acts 16:9, it is an image that explicitly equates mission with movement. These initiatives coincided with the rise of pietism in Germany and Northern Europe. August Hermann Franke's millenarian vision of global Protestantism and the creation of an empire of God inspired the establishment of the Danish Halle mission to Southeast India, centered on the trading port of Tranquebar. In the same period, the Moravians launched missions in the Atlantic colonies of Denmark and the Dutch Republic, stretching from Greenland and Suriname to South Africa. This marked the moment when the Reformation definitively embraced mobility and sought to spread its message to the world. Protestantism's concept of conversion was shaped by its theology of salvation. Justification by faith and predestination created a distinctive missionary dynamic. Regeneration was the product of divine will, not of human agency. This had the effect of turning emotion from a tool for achieving conversion into empirical proof that it had occurred. The upheavals and heartbreakings that converts felt inside their bodies and souls suggested that they'd been singled out for the gift of salvation, but they did not guarantee it. The affective experiences promoted by Protestant missions were accorded different significance. Pietism fostered a more inclusive vision, rooted in the revitalization of the Lutheran idea of the priesthood of all believers. For the Moravians, conversion was a matter of the heart that centered on sensing this organ melting, warming, and moving within one. It too was an embodied phenomenon in which new disciples joined a community of love and manifested their joy in abundant tears. On each side of the confessional divide, weeping and fervour were perceived as the marks of a sincere convert. In conjunction with piety, civility, and morality, they were read as proxies for the success of evangelical endeavours. Like their Catholic counterparts, Protestant missionaries often worried that the zeal of converts was not all it seemed. Tears might be feigned, godliness might be superficial, and ardently pious acolytes might be dissembling their devotion to Christ. Optimism about the depth of these conversions dimmed and was replaced by concern that indigenous people were not capable of being converted at all. Pity for the poor Indians was twinned with a conviction that they were to blame for not accepting the blessing of the Christian faith and for relapsing into their original barbarism. The compassion that missionary societies sought to elicit for their efforts bred a moral superiority that underscored senses of difference. At their centre was what Laura Stevens calls a knot of ambivalent benevolence. It's been argued that in 17th century Virginia, Native Americans were increasingly regarded as hereditary heathens, whose inability to adopt and internalize Christianity was an immutable trait and a function of lineage. Rebecca Gertz locates in this development the origins of racial thinking. This coincided with growing distrust of Jewish conversos in Spain and Portugal. It reflected an emerging tendency to understand race less as a fluid entity than as a fixed set of attributes linked with biology and blood. The assumptions that underpinned both these developments were rooted in the same concerns about sincerity, hypocrisy, and duplicity that afflicted individual believers. At every level, religious conversion, like other forms of religious mobility, was surrounded by a penumbra of ambiguity. Some revisionist historians have sought to liberate the Reformation from what they call the meta-narrative of conversion, arguing that this impedes our understanding of the pragmatic, collaborative, and contingent quality of the religious revolution that swept across early modern Europe. My aim here, by contrast, has been to reassert the value of this paradigm. Defined as the turn of the soul, conversion was both a central impulse of the whole Reformation project and a source of evolving unease. It compelled people to strive for internal religious renewal and to make difficult decisions in the interests of their spiritual health. It promoted emotional practices in which believers found proof of the sincerity and veracity of their experiences, but it also fostered suspicions about apostasy and hypocrisy. It caused converts to search their hearts to discern what was true and what was false, and it compelled missionaries to question whether their endeavours had really changed the hearts and minds of their proselytes. The circulation of conversion narratives had similarly paradoxical effects. It encouraged people to intensify their piety and search for a church or faith in which they would find salvation. Simultaneously, it raised concerns that the inner turmoil that conversion unleashed might not come from God, but be the product of deceptive and even pathological feelings. I shall return to this theme in tomorrow's lecture, which investigates what contemporaries meant when they spoke of commotions.
Thank you so much, Professor Walsham. As we've come to expect by now, a wonderfully wide-ranging lecture covering everything from St. Paul to the New World and everything in between. I'm sure you've given us lots of things to think about and ask questions. We have around about 25 minutes or so for questions. Only for the audience here, I'm afraid. If you're listening on the live stream, we're not able to take questions from you, though you will be able to hear the questions and the answers. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand and Louise will come around with the microphone. Would anybody like to start us off? Yeah, here, Sarah.
Thank you very much for that. Very, very evocative and stimulating as ever. I've started lecturing on this, but I'm a patrist, as you might know, so I'm at home in the 2nd to 5th centuries, but started lecturing on this period the last 2 years, mainly on the Jesuits, because I'm the kind of token Catholic about the place. So, I know the Dominicans much better, both in the Middle Ages and now, but I wondered whether you have found what strikes me when I look at this whole history and looking at the history of the Jesuits from the 16th, 17th, 18th century right across the globe is really, really interesting. And something was also, I think, true of the Dominicans and Franciscans in previous generations. When they get bored fighting with the other orders, or the other, presumably after 16th century, the other denominations, they start fighting with each other. And so it's not really possible to characterize what the Jesuits do or what the... And I wonder if this is the same with the different groups of Protestants, because actually they're all reacting against their own friends and associates and their own fellow professionals and saying, you're doing this all wrong. And, you know, you could characterize this as the sort of caring people who respect other people's cultures. I mean, certainly with the Dominicans you can, versus, obviously the Salamanca debates where you're precisely debating, are the Indians human or not? And you have Bartolome de las Casas on one side and so on the other. And you can point to similar people among the Jesuits. So I suppose my question is, does this also happen among the different groups of Protestants, both from group to group and also within the different denominations, that eventually you just become more interested in having fine-grained arguments with each other than with anybody else, because nobody else understands the problem quite as well as the person next to you in the choir who you're really annoyed by?
Thank you. Yes, I'm sure you're right about that. And I think that that helps to explain the kind of fragmentation and pluralism of the Reformation when they begin to fight with each other more than they're fighting with the so-called other enemy. So yes, I think that's quite right. I think that what they're often in conflict about are kind of questions of the intricacies of theological processes of salvation, for example, and, for example, the role of the will as opposed to divine grace, and that is one of the areas around which some of these tensions emerge. But I suppose I'd also say that I think that as time progresses, they are becoming conscious that their conversions that they've wrought are not as effective as they'd hoped in that sort of idealistic first phase. And that promotes a kind of heart-searching, and it also promotes this sort of, infighting across different denominational kind of borders.
Then your point about hypocrisy is particularly interesting.
Can you just wait for the microphone?
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I found your point about hypocrisy, and both this lecture and last week's, particularly interesting, that people worrying about whether they themselves are hypocrites and whether everybody else is a hypocrite.
Yep.
And it becomes more, as things get more and more complex and time starts turning faster and faster faster, as it does in the 16th and 17th century.
Right.
That's a really interesting kind of marker of everybody thinking, look, are we all just hypocrites when you get right down to it?
Exactly. They think they're living in a kind of, or working in a hall of mirrors, really. They don't know what to believe and what to trust.
Over there, question over there. Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent lecture, and I just would like to expand on the same question about the sincerity and how do we measure the conversion? When is it actually sincere, and how do we know? Because even the Saint Augustine in Confessions kind of wrote that having doubt is a very, very healthy thing. So how do we know what is genuine, what is not genuine, when is it enough, and is at the same time as well. I listen a lot of Alan Watts. You would be familiar with Alan Watts, right? And he speaks about that Jewish people have this thing called the Yetzer Hara, which is like an irreducible rascality, that God has given every single one of us this like grain of eviliciousness for every single one of us. And apparently it's a very, very healthy thing to do, because again, going from the Eastern kind of a perspective, going from an Eastern perspective and thinking from like yin and yang, if you don't really have the two opposites kind of the interplay, the constant kind of a conflict, the rediscovering the good, winning versus the bad and things like that, so yeah.
Thank you.
Your opinion, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, doubt is a very, very interesting issue here. And among the sort of 17th century Puritans that I've spent quite a lot of my career exploring in one way or another, actually they're caught between this kind of dilemma that doubt might be a sign of reprobation, but it might also be a healthy sign that they are one of the saved. So again, that they simply don't know how to interpret the precise nature of that. And they're worried that if they don't have doubt, then actually that is probably a sign of damnation. So it's a kind of world of optical illusions. And at the heart of those optical illusions, or those sensual illusions, is the question of how you interpret your own emotions and your own feelings. So I think doubt's a very important part of that, yes.
Thank you.
Yep, Susan, over here.
Thank you very much indeed for a wonderful lecture where I think, you know, what you brought across so well, the sort of parallels across confessions. Now, when we hear Luther talking about his conversion, he's talking many years later. And one of the problems about accessing the experience of conversion is that often people are writing later.
Yes.
And they're often conforming to some kind of code that they know, that other people know, and they'll be looking for particular signs in them.
Yep.
So I wonder if I could ask you to comment on that, because it seems to me that is also something that crosses confessions, because no matter what the doctrine, you've still got this question of behaving to an emotional code.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think that at whatever point somebody puts down in writing, or indeed orally pronounces their conversion experience, that is an act of memory and retrospection. And it therefore is always shaped by the cultural conventions and the kind of templates that people inherit as part of their culture. That doesn't mean, though, that I think it doesn't work in the other direction. I think that people's, reading of conversion narratives helps to shape their experience, but it kind of works in the other way too, that, experience feeds into those narratives. And so over time, again, you kind of see subtle evolutions in those things. So I think, it's very easy for us as historians. This is at the center of the methodological problems that face historians of emotion, that we only have those lettery, textual, discursive traces. How can we get back to actual feeling? But, we know also, don't we, that how much images, texts shape how we think about the world. And therefore, we kind of have to think imaginatively about that in this period too.
Over here.
Yes, well, thank you for another sort of fascinating lecture. My question sort of continuing on from this discussion in a way, but it's about the question of authority. How can you govern a world when all this stuff is happening inside people's hearts? Because, the rulers can't know. And I mean, Elizabeth I famously said she didn't want to make windows into men's souls, but the point is you can't. And, so how can you work out if your subjects are loyal or not? And I mean, the best I can do is to think of, sort of confessional oaths and, the sort of implementation of various oaths of loyalty. And there's possibly a sort of trajectory of the rise and fall of religious oaths over several centuries, but I'm sure there's much more to it than that, and your reflections on, how do you govern would be very welcome.
Yeah, thank you. That's another excellent question, and I think it's very intriguing how, if we take the case of England, the Elizabethan regime, the Act of Uniformity requires people to attend church. It doesn't require them to make pronouncements about their doctrinal convictions. And that is seen as a kind of good strategy by the regime to persuade people to, convert to the Protestant faith. But as time progresses, they realize that all that is doing is providing a cover for, dissimulation. And so it's really interesting that by the early 17th century, there is a statute in the wake of the gunpowder plot that says you must take communion, because that is more of a litmus test of people's belief. That too can lead to dissimulation as well. So increasingly, it becomes impossible to use these mechanisms to convert, and that's where people start to recognize that coercion produces hypocrisy, and that is one of the roots of toleration.
Yeah, over here.
Thank you very much. And I think just bridging from that question, it seems to me that the phrase you used early on, communities of emotion, would be interesting to hear a bit more from you about, and maybe that does connect to your early work on toleration and this new material, which is ultimately about exclusion, quite a lot of it, and racialization and so forth. So yes, what are communities of emotion, and how do you join one or not?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. Of course, what I'm alluding to there is the work of Barbara Rosenwein, who coined this notion of emotional communities, which has been debated and contested, not least because it does imply often a kind of homogeneity, which perhaps overstates the coherence of feeling being a highly fluid thing, and evanescent, elusive, etc. But I think it still has some merit, because if you, for example, take the example of conversion narratives, people reading these narratives, then themselves writing narratives about their own conversion experiences, are kind of joined in a kind of common, sort of collectivity around those experiences. So I think it does have some value, but it needs to be conscious of the heterogeneity of human experience at the same time.
Yeah, over here.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, once again, to salute your marvelous range and your fascinating capacity to raise question after question, interpretation after interpretation. So much respect to existing scholarship from so many fields. I wondered, naturally fascinated by your citation of Oliver Cromwell, an old friend to any Irish Catholic. And I'm not being ironical. An Irish Catholic looking at history in general, and you'll suddenly see the name of Cromwell. Ah, yes. So here is Cromwell in a way I had not seen him before, somebody with this imperial vision. And yet, he wasn't, in the last analysis. Everybody remembers Cromwell in Ireland. There's fascinating disputation as to whether he was as bad as people made out. He was, in fact, somebody who won applause from Gaelic Catholics for his honesty, contrasting it with civil servants and figures like that. And in a way, it pinpoints out, because Ireland stands as a howling disaster from the point of view of Protestant evangelicalism. You could get out of it nicely if you say, oh, well, they're all damned anyway. But then how is the Calvinist evangelical and the Calvinist predestinationist to accord with one another? Why, from that point of view, did you only have a marvelous figure like William Bedell, who desperately tried to convert the Catholics by the use of the language, and converted some very remarkable people, including the ancestors of Richard Brinsley Sheridan and so forth. But at the same time, Bedell is the only one. And he ends up, after all, by being buried, escorted to a grave by insurgent Irish Catholics in the middle of the bloody rebellion of 1641, who say, if only they'd been all like him, there wouldn't have been a rebellion. So good old Bedell, sorry about Cromwell. And I'm wondering, isn't the Irish example something which stands, unfortunately, as appallingly questioning to so many of the assumptions?
Well, that's a huge huge area to explore. I mean, I think that what I'd say is that one of the problems with our attempt to understand Cromwell and indeed Irish history in the 16th and 17th centuries is the long shadow cast by what's subsequently happened, but also by the tendency for us to try to impose our assumptions about religious coexistence, toleration, etc., back on a past where those assumptions were very different. I mean, I think Cromwell's kind of evangelizing missionary ideal that I talked about does sit in tension with what Irish Catholics know about his activities in Drogheda and Wexford in particular. But in a way, they're not incompatible, I would say, because part of the reason for saying that is that Cromwellian senses of toleration and of outreach are all about converting people or tolerating people within your own family of faith. People outside that family of faith have no right to exist or to be tolerated. And that's where I think that what we find difficult to understand can work and be compatible with their worldview. I will say a little bit more about Cromwell if I have time tomorrow, so we might have an opportunity to take that question up again then. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Have to come back. Another question at the back there.
Thank you again for another wonderful lecture. I wonder whether we could go back to the point you made about coercion as a route to hypocrisy and tolerance in some way a mitigation for that. Mm-hmm. And just to wonder about the problem of toleration, or toleration being portrayed as a form of hypocrisy. So to bring it to the modern day, wherever there are animated and effective disputes about gender or whether this counts as a disease or not, actually people who try and hold a middle ground often find themselves torn asunder from both sides and portrayed as hypocrites even as they try and show toleration.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an interesting comment. I think one thing to say in response to that is that in the period that I'm concerned with, toleration is always a highly ambivalent idea. It's something you don't want to do. You know, you tolerate something like you tolerate pain. You don't like it, you endure it. So toleration is a solution to a problem that you can't solve in another way. And it therefore does involve a kind of moral dilemma, because you don't want to do this, but circumstances are compelling you to do that. And I do think that sheds some interesting light on some of the dilemmas of our own time. I've often thought of Goethe talking very poignantly or compellingly about toleration as to tolerate is to insult, he said, which is such a striking thing to say. But also, I've thought often in recent years about the world that we live in feeling to me like what we see is a kind of intolerance of tolerance.
Thank you. Probably time for one more question. Alvin, over there.
Thanks again, Alex, very, very much. Can I ask you put on screen the title page, I think, of a 17th century translation of Augustine's Confessions? And I just wondered the extent to which Augustine transcends the confessional divide and has a universal appeal. And by extension as well, I wondered the extent to which the 4th and 5th century church and its schisms and its heresies spoke to or provided templates for those of the era of the Reformations.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, Augustine, yes, he's everybody's property and they're all fighting about having him. And there are translations, Catholic, Protestant, multiple translations. And that is also illustrating that there's not kind of hard confessional blocks. Protestants might read a Catholic translation, or Catholics might read a Protestant translation, and so that it creates that kind of porousness about the boundaries. And yes, of course, they are also looking back to sort of different phases in church history and deploying those, not only as kind of weapons, but also as evidence, because, of course, Reformation is about turning back to an idealized past. So the past is the yardstick by which you judge what's happening in the present and what should happen in the future. So it's a battleground, and all of those things are revived. What you see is a constant resurrection of these core texts, episodes and incidents being, brought up at various key moments in the political context and used. Yeah.
We've got a couple of minutes. Can I just ask you another question about this idealized past? I mean, it seemed to me, as a scholar of Christian origins, and I suppose this is a question I'm likely to ask, but the Acts of the Apostles has all of these stories of conversion, and they're all identical, that somebody converts, the Spirit comes, and it's this great emotional outpouring, great joy, great, hearts burning within them. And I wondered to what extent, I mean, it is really a blueprint, isn't it, for how you do things? And to what extent does Acts of the Apostles get sort of drawn on in these debates, or are they all far more interested in the great Paul?
No, Acts does come in quite a lot, yeah. I haven't done any kind of, analysis of how frequently Acts is deployed by comparison with, the Gospels or the Pauline epistles. But yes, it definitely comes up, and you've seen how much their missionary ideal is an apostolic ideal, and the peregrinations of Paul and all of that are, that's the model they have for their own activities. So they're kind of living out history in their own time. Yeah. The Bible is a living text for them.
Yeah, thank you. That's so fascinating. Anyway, we've come to almost the end now. Thank you once again to Professor Walsham. The quality of the questions, I think, is always an indication of the quality of the lecture and the interesting questions that you've evoked in people's minds. I'd also like to thank our venue hosts, people who asked questions, those of you who came here to the lecture hall, and all of those behind the scenes who made each of these lectures such a success, particularly Glowcast, our technical team. And just to remind you too that there are 2 more lectures in this series. I hope to see many of you there, though of course they are being live streamed if you can't make the in-person event. So with that then, we'll end. I wish you a good evening and a safe journey home, and perhaps we can thank our lecturer once again. Thank you.